Okay, now we move on to Oceania, our part of the world. And maybe more so than some other areas, obviously there's certain physical factors that are absolutely really key to understanding this part of the Pacific. First, as with the whole issue like West Asia versus Asia and Europe, you have to remember the definition of Oceania is pretty arbitrary. Let's quickly switch here. A sec. So we can visually look at this. Okay. Think about, for example, the Philippines, Indonesia are considered part of Southeast Asia. Excuse me. By contrast, New Guinea in the area over here is considered part of the Pacific or part of Oceania. We use the Oceania instead of the Pacific because the Pacific has a lot of very complicated different meanings. To folks, for example, in the United States and also in Asia, they talk about the Pacific, but they mean is the Pacific Rim. So it includes any area that's basically touched by the Pacific Ocean. We tend to look at it differently because while on one hand it's arbitrary, these areas do have sort of different histories and most importantly are very different in modern world affairs. And so separating, Asia and what you might call island Southeast Asia from, Oceania is sort of conceptually a valuable way to do it. And it also has a huge amount of impact. Having said that, if you go to much of the mainland United States, for example, dealing with the federal government, they oftentimes conflate someplace like Seattle, Honolulu, and Tokyo into the same package as being part of the Pacific, without realizing that folks in the Central Pacific really have a whole different set of sort of constituent issues to deal with. So Oceania, obviously the biggest player in here is this large body of water. The Pacific Ocean is by far the world's largest single physical feature. 1/5 of the world's surface is covered by the Pacific Ocean. And so when you're looking at it, this really dominates Oceania. And this is one of the reasons it makes it different than, for example, even like island Southeast Asia, where you're basically, just by very short distances connected to Asia proper. In the Pacific, you don't have that. Most famous actually would probably be us here in the North Pacific. We're basically equidistant to almost the entire West Coast with a difference of a couple hundred miles. Because if you think about it, the distances this way are about the same. Distances with a lot of Asia are actually sort of similar. And so what you get is it's 2,500 miles from here to any place of any size. And so that type of enormous water distance is what really, really defines the Pacific in terms of Oceania from other areas where you maybe have islands in an ocean. Here, the entire package is very, very much isolates surrounded by a large body of water. Second, this is a lot less visible, is there's actually two chunks to Oceania. And though they didn't know when they originally made this split, the idea that you actually split this section, for example, and call it Oceania, and you call this section in Southeast Asia, turns out to actually be quite accurate from a geologic point of view. If you go back, billions of years, what you have is you have continental drift in the former continents. Pangaea was the continent that, basically the Antarctica is a part of, and also what's now Australia, this area was also a part of it. Over time, these pieces of surface split off and started sort of sliding around on the semi-molten surface of the planet. And so these crustal pieces, which we call continental plates, have been sliding around. We saw that discussion. We were talking about how the South Asian plates crashing into the Asian plate here, resulting in the Himalayas. In the case of this part of the world, what happens is a whole chunk of the planet, particularly the Australasian plate, snaps loose, ages ago and starts wandering around this part of the world, not really heading anywhere in a particular hurry. And just as a note, we're part of the North Pacific plate, and so we're actually going this way quite rapidly. But the Australasian plate is sort of sitting here. Now, at one point, it was moving quite quickly, and so what happened is it was moving to the west. Pieces basically broke off, so you can sort of visualize it like a pickup truck full of stuff, and stuff's just blowing out of the bed of the truck. And what happened is a big piece snapped off on the right side, and that became New Zealand. In fact, you can see the match here with this part of the Australian continent. And this section up here is a part to the north snapped off, and that became Papua New Guinea, or I should say New Guinea Island proper. And then a lot of the islands here are actually also remnant pieces. Tasmania pretty obviously plugs right into here. And so what happens is you've got a lot of these islands in this particular area, including New Caledonia, are basically remnants of this former larger continent that's broken up at the fringes. Now, the key that's important to remember with all this, and this is area that we should call Melanesia over here, New Zealand and Australia, is that these particular areas are very, very old rock. In fact, the Australian continental rock is some of the oldest on the planet. The only other parts that are about that same age are some of the areas in Central Africa. So it's very, very, very old real estate. In fact, if we do this, you can sort of see that, if you look at the Australian continent, it's actually very much like sort of worn out slipper. There's almost no tread left. The idea of mountains over here would be hills anywhere else. And a huge part of the continent is what used to be this enormous inland sea that basically covered a huge part, basically almost everything in sort of orange red here. And so what you've got is a very, very, very old piece of real estate. It's a very complicated piece of real estate. And that complicated piece of real estate includes New Guinea, New Zealand, and the Melanesian islands here. Now, the reason that's important is very old pieces of real estate tend to have very complicated mineral reserves. And so one of the results, that wasn't really realized, for example, in the rest of this area till really recently, but certainly Australia for a while ago, is that you have enormous mineral reserves, gold, copper, you name it, is found in Australia. In fact, it's one of the world's largest copper and coal producers. And so that's because of this fact that it's old material. And what that means is all this stuff also has large amounts of mineral reserves. New Caledonia over here, for example, is one of the world's largest nickel reserves outside of Russia. You don't see the same thing in here. Southeast Asia, even island Southeast Asia, is a much newer piece of property and it doesn't have a lot of that same sort of mineral complexity. So what you have when you get into the Pacific, specifically Melanesia and the area around Australia, et cetera, is you've got a tremendous amount of mineral reserves. And the key that makes this important is these mineral reserves weren't recognized or realized or even exploited until basically the last 100 years. So unlike mineral reserves in other parts, like say, North America, or especially say Europe or something like that, where, they've been digging at them, in the case of Europe for maybe 1,000, 2,000 years, digging this stuff up. Here in Australia, you not only have enormous reserves, but they're basically only being used now. So this gives them a tremendous advantage in terms of, again, the non-renewable resources and the fact that those resources are being exploited now versus having been taken out in the past and basically lost or used up, you might say. There's actually, here's the gap between this particular continental plate and the Southeast Asian plate. Southeast Asian plate is also moving west. This one's moving slightly faster. And again, you can see the break zone here. In fact, if you look here, you can see the stress fractures between these two plates and sort of this crush zone, which is one reason why Indonesia has such an enormous number of volcanoes, is the fact that the Australian plate is moving into it, creating enormous amounts of stress on the two continental plates. So what you've got here when you look at this part of Oceania is very old real estate. And from a mineral standpoint, very rich real estate. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of ways to make money. There's a lot of stuff you can exploit. Now, having said that, if you noticed here, you can see the eastern edge of this plate, which really breaks off right at the middle part of Fiji. And so what happens if you're anywhere else in the Pacific, if you're in, the other part of Polynesia, if you're in Micronesia to the north, you're not in that zone. You're in a zone of basically volcanic islands, like we just saw in the last couple of weeks with Tonga. And so what you are, in fact, you can see Tonga right here is on this rift between the South Pacific plate and the Australian plate, which is why you have volcanic activity. So in the rest of the Pacific, all you've got is volcanic rock. So, for example, in the case of Hawaii, we're some of the youngest pieces of real estate on planet Earth. So you're not going to find any minerals. You're not going to find any of this geologic complexity that you do. And this tends to be something that people don't think about is, on one hand, Oceania is all an area surrounded by water. But the Melanesian part of Oceania is such that it's part of some of the richest mineral reserves on the planet. In the rest of the Pacific, they have absolutely nothing in terms of mineral reserves or anything the rest of the world wants. There's nothing that you can do in Samoa that's going to make people from the rest of the planet come pounding away to your door and basically say, sell it to us. And so what this means is for the rest of Oceania, the islands and now the island countries, the island states in the Pacific, sort of fall into two entirely separate categories. If you're Vanuatu or the Solomons or the French colony of New Caledonia or your Papua New Guinea, you've got ways to make money. You've got mineral reserves. You can sell stuff. You can pollute your property. You can do all sorts of stuff. But you've got options. If you're Wallis and Futuna, if you're Tonga, if you're the Cooks or you're Samoa, you don't have any of those options. You do not have any sort of wealth or resources the rest of the planet wants. Now, to a certain extent, you have a little bit because you, of course, have the ocean and you've controlled 200 miles around you. But if you look, that also leaves a huge chunk of real estate, which is under no one's control. And to be honest, most Pacific islands don't have the military or technical resources to even protect the waters they've got. The waters around Samoa and American Samoa are famous for being fished out by Chinese fishing vessels. And there's nothing the governments can do because basically they don't have the resources to have patrols out there. And, threatening the Chinese is sort of a waste of time anyways for some small Pacific island state. So the Pacific Islands and Oceania sort of fall into two options. And this is entirely based on the physical reality of the world that we live in, where basically the huge majority, with the exception of the Hawaiian Islands, is south of the equator. So they're at the equator or south. And they're very, very small pieces of real estate in a very, very, very large ocean. And so the end result is they do not have anything that makes them even players in the global economic system, except maybe in a few cases location. But more accurately, it's usually just accidents of history. And as we'll see a little further on, this is a huge part of the Pacific, as the colonial presence here tends to be radically different than it is, even Southeast Asia or something like that, because you do not have the resources that someone else wants. It's not like you're the Celebes of this part that's Indonesia, where you've got oil, you've got spices, and people in the world have been spending thousands of years trying to figure out how to get there. Don't feel bad, but no one's been thousands of years trying to figure out how to get to Guam or to Chuuk or to, Tokelau or someplace like that. There's no interest in the world system in much of the Pacific. And so that means the Pacific Islanders and Pacific Island states really are very low on the radar of folks on the rest of the planet because they just don't see any particular sort of intrinsic value to the populations there where they should spend some time and interest worrying about them.